The way I think about intuition now is that it is more to do with your nurture, your kind of human nature telling you something. And I think in the modern world, there's kind of there's almost like a kind of spectrum of kind of I guess behaving. And on the one side, right, you've got your kind of intuition, your gut sense. On the other side, you might have data. Now, these two aren't sort of completely at opposite ends of the spectrum, but I have a feeling that a lot of people now will seek to ignore this one and seek the data in order to prove something to themselves. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with kind of seeking data, but equally there are some things that are really hard to measure, and therefore the quality of data can often be a bit rubbish, to be honest. So, for example, a lot of people will say to me, like, you know, kind of, how do you measure the value of the programs that you sort of implement? And I'm like, well, look, I'll measure whatever you want me to measure. You know, we can measure that, but how do you measure the trust? How do you measure the value of a good upbringing? How do you measure the effectiveness and health of a relationship? If you can tell me how to do that, then I can tell you how to measure a leadership development program. And there are lots of people will probably, say, oh, you absolutely can do it. I'm like, well, I think if leadership is about behavior, if leadership is about relationships and inspiring people, it's really difficult to do. And I'm just cautious with anyone that sort of says that they can kind of do that. So I've been thinking about how do you sort of balance that? How do you listen to your intuition? And I think it's something that you have to kind of keep relearning. It's this constant thing of, like, when you've made a mistake, or when you've kind of got something wrong, or when something hasn't worked out quite as you expected, thinking about, right, beforehand, did I get any sense at any point in time that this was sort of going to go south, or this was going to go in this direction? If so, why did I ignore it? That's a really interesting question to kind of reflect on. Or equally, like, you know, if this is a kind of pattern of behavior that I've been demonstrating over and over again, how can I create some sort of data, or how can I measure some things that will maybe give me some amber or red warnings to help me realize that you're going down the wrong path again. And I think that those kind of two spectrums or that sort of spectrum, that kind of way of thinking is really helpful. But you only kind of really can understand that if you're thinking about, like, what went well, what didn't go well, what have I learned from that? Equally, like, where can my strengths potentially become a weakness? I was reading a really good book by David Epstein called Range, which talks about actually how a breadth of areas of interest or specialism can be really, really valuable, because you can sort of draw parallels between sort of two areas, and creating the space for people's intuition to be able to be used in order to make decisions is really important in an organization. And the example that they used was, the example that he talks about towards the end of the book, talks about NASA and the Challenger disaster. And it's really interesting because it talks about NASA's basic kind of cultural philosophy being, unless you can prove it through data, we're not interested. And I think that, again, a lot of the time, that's not a bad way of behaving. And lots of organizations could shift the needle in that direction and find it really, really helpful. But equally, what if there isn't enough data to prove something? Which there wasn't when you dig into the detail of kind of the O-rings and the failure of them that caused the NASA disaster. The shuttle engineers couldn't prove that something was wrong because they're like, we don't know. We've never tested this. We're completely outside the parameters for what we know and understand about how this thing will perform. And that intuition, that gut feeling of, I don't think this is going to work, they couldn't relay that to their leadership, to their managers, because they didn't have enough data points to drive the decision. and to sort of make that thing happen. And I think that, when I sort of think about Afghanistan, if someone had said to me, Rod, prove to me that there is something wrong with this picture, with this scenario, a lot of the time I would be, I can't prove it to you. I can't tell you why. I just know something's not right. And one of the best leaders I ever worked for, who went on to become the Commandant General of the Royal Marines, a guy called Charlie Stickland, who's an outstanding leader. He said to me, and I still remember it to this day, he was like, he used to have these joining meetings at his house with every single new officer, time intensive, probably got loads of better things to do, but, he prioritized his people, and that just came through him entirely, top to bottom. And he said to me, you're going into a role as the sort of second in command of a company. Trust your intuition, trust your judgment. The words he exactly used were trust your spidey sense. If you think something is wrong, it's wrong. You may need to go and collect data and find out why, but trust that intuition. That's a voice that has effectively kind of kept your ancestors alive long enough to see you sat in this room in front of me. And therefore there's value in it. So if you think something's wrong, it's definitely wrong. You just need to find out why. And I think that again, coming back to helpful principles, helpful ways in which you can sort of live your life, that's really, really helpful. If you were about to start a business with someone and you're just not sure whether you trust them, whether they're the right person, don't do it. Yeah. Don't do it. Going into partnership in a business with someone is a marriage. And if you think about it in any other terms, then it's not going to work out. It is a professional marriage, and you have to be really clear about what it is you both want out of that. But equally, if you have any sense that you're like, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure I trust this guy, if you are aware of their weaknesses and they irritate you, those are going to become massive fissures and cracks in the relationship further down the line. It's going into those things with kind of open eyes, but sort of trusting your intuition, trusting your gut, hugely important.